Hello and welcome everyone to the TGfU SIG's webinar series. We're hoping to relaunch a lot of our webinars and this is one of our first ones that we are showcasing. We have the pleasure today of Brendan SueSee, who is a senior lecturer in the University of Southern Queensland, and we have Shane Pill, who is a professor at Flinders University. What I'm going to do is hand over to you two gentlemen, and when you're ready, off you go.
Thanks, Alan. Can I just ask that everybody check that they've got their microphones off, because there's a few little garbles going off in the background. Dr. Seuss, did you want to lead us off with the introductions?
Certainly, Professor GameSense. Thanks very much for this opportunity to present with Shane this evening, Ellen, and thanks very much for everyone who's dropped in for the chat. This afternoon or this evening or this morning, wherever it is in your part of the world, we're going to discuss examples of open-ended questioning in game-based approaches. We're trying to give a few examples of questioning and what that can lead to in terms of outcomes. And finally, we're not just going to be completely negative Nancy's saying, oh, this doesn't work or that doesn't work. And we're going to suggest ways, teaching styles or pedagogies, whatever term you wish to use questioning to try and meet these goals and objectives. Over to you, Pilly.
Next slide, please, Dr. Seuss.
Is that right?
Thanks for joining us. Yep, got it here. Thank you, everyone online, for joining us today. I begin by acknowledging that I speak to you today from the... Oh, it's gone too far ahead, Dr. Seuss.
Sorry, mate. I think it's on automatic, is it? There we go.
Speak to you today from the land of the Kaurna people. Acknowledge the Kaurna people as the historical custodians of this land, the continuing connection to country. This land was never ceded, always was, and always will be Kaurna people's land. Brendan, where do you speak from today?
I'm speaking to you from Yagara land, so Gurrumbigi, or good day to you all.
It's tradition of the Kaurna people that we relate before we start to do business, and it will be very difficult for Brendan and I to get your story, but storytelling is a very big tradition of the land that I meet on with you today. So a little bit about myself. I'm a Cornish, Estonian, Greek, Australian, Greek and Estonian on my mother's side, Cornish on my father's side. Spent most of my life here on Kaurna land. I live in an area called Kurtawita for the dark forest. This area was pre-colonisation of peppermint gum forest, which is very different from most of the Adelaide Plains, which was low-lying scrub and marshy land with the River Torrens not actually finding its way out to sea, but going into a fairly swampy area of land. Fortunately, there are still some remnants on some of the blocks of land that still have big backyards of the trees, the peppermint gum trees that used to be in this area, but with urbanisation, a lot of that canopy is increasingly disappearing, which is disappointing. Next slide, please, Brendan. I'm going to credit Brendan with shifting my understanding of a game-based approach quite substantially. A number of years ago, Brendan approached me to help with a paper that he was writing because he had been looking at game-based approaches, and in particular the idea of questioning through the lens of the spectrum of teaching styles, and he'd seen that I and others had described the questioning strategies that exist within a game-based approach as guided discovery. Admittedly, I was using the term guided discovery as in strongly guided instruction, that the teacher or the coach knew the questions that they were going to ask and were guiding the learner towards the understanding that was part of the specific requirements of the task at the time. But within a spectrum of teaching styles approach, guided discovery has a very particular meaning. And Brendan's challenged me on the idea that questioning in a game-based approach was actually discovery learning, wasn't necessarily discovery learning. And in many of the examples that I and others had used of questioning within a game-based approach and even within a constraints-led approach were actually, from a spectrum perspective, not examples of students creating new understanding, creation where no existing knowledge, skills or capability had previously existed, and we'll explain more about that perspective as we go through. Next slide, please, Brendan. So we begin with the assumption that one of the distinctive pedagogies of a game-based approach is not actually the fact that we play games. Games have been part of the teaching lexicon of physical education and sports coaches for as long as anybody can remember, and indeed we find reference to approaches that look like descriptions of a game-based approach today going back into sports coaching and physical education books in the 1950s. When we read the descriptions of game-based coaching, what seems to be distinctive is the shift from a directive pedagogy where the learner is asked to reproduce what the coach or the teacher is prescribing through them. Richard Tinning calls this often demonstrate, explain, practice, or the DEP model. Mosston, back in the 1960s, also described it very similarly that way, a replicative approach to teaching where the coach or the teacher was the font of the knowledge, and the closer the replication that the player could do to the performance demonstration of the teacher or coach, the better the learning that was being exhibited by that player. So games aren't the distinctive feature of a game-based approach. Certainly the positioning of games within a game-based approach is distinctive because games are the central organising feature of the learning of the lesson. But it's this shift, this pedagogical shift, which we might describe as a move from a behaviourist tradition to a constructivist position, where the learner is in the position of creating their meaning and their understanding through the experience and the cognitive focus and the shaping that is provided by the questioning strategy of the teacher or the coach, that is the distinctive feature of a game-based approach. So to begin with, we want to make sure that we're understanding that this distinctiveness of a game-based approach is putting the players in a problem-solving position, giving the players the ownership of the cognitive operations of problem-solving, of creating the meaning, creating the knowledge that will lead to the behaviour that we see in the games. Many of the game-based approaches describe this as a guided discovery approach through the use of open-ended questions. And as I alluded to just a few moments ago, we'll challenge that game-based approaches are typically guided discovery, perhaps question whether many of the examples that we see in the books are actually examples of discovery learning at all, and can't be presumed that just because we're doing a game-based approach, that we're putting the students in a position where they are challenged to be creative, evaluative, or in an analytical position to create understanding from the opportunities that they're being provided with. Next slide, please, Brendan. The part of a game-based approach is play a game and identify the problems. Going back into the 1970s and possibly earlier, but certainly at my age, it's the 1970s that I'm more familiar with from my early readings. This idea that the game sets the problem and the coach or the teacher uses that as stimulus material to inquire about the skills, knowledge and understanding the players are bringing to the performance context is not new. The positioning of the game as the thing that we need to learn to do has been around for a very long time. So the game-based approach, we want to play the game. We've identified a problem that the game is going to exemplify. And when that moment in the game that we know is going to occur, because we've deliberately chosen this game because it will set up a particular problem and that problem will emerge in the moment, then as Eric Worthington and others describe, we'll stop that. We will then go in with our inquiry strategy to make meaning of the moment. We will then find out whether we've been able to focus the students' understanding and cognitively shape their performance by returning to the game and seeing if the game behaviour is able to change from that inquiry strategy that we put in place. So putting the players as learners into the problem-solving situation is around formulating strategies and action plans used through the inquiry process that they will then implement when they go back into the gameplay. Next slide, please, Brendan. So from a spectrum of teaching styles perspective, we're playing a game. The teacher or the coach is standing back and using their observational skills to analyse behaviour and wait to see for the moment that they're going to come in with their intervention strategy, which is a questioning approach. So the pre-impact subject matter is typically the teacher will explain the game. Often they will do a demonstration so that there is some sort of mental representation of what the expectations are, and they will set the outcome of the game. For example, in this one, the students might be instructed to play a 3v3 keep away game and complete as many passes as possible within a defined space with rules in place should they go out of that space for the turnover of the ball. The impact set, as we would describe it from a spectrum, is actually playing the game. We then go into a post-impact set where we will evaluate what happened in the game and use the inquiry or reflective strategy in order to try and draw out the learning. So we might find out that the students can't keep possession of the ball. We understood, because we know our players, that that was going to be the problem that the game presented to the players. And then the teacher, in this instance, has not instructed the students to discover a problem, but has used a questioning strategy to identify the problem. It is most likely that the answers that the players will draw upon come from their memory, from their experiences, whether that's their observational experience of more advanced players on the TV or performances, or from their own experience of playing, to problem solve, but not to discover. Identify solutions from their existing understanding of the game. Next slide, please, Brendan. So the post-impact set in a game-based approach, we would argue, when we do that inquiry or reflective approach, is most often in the examples that we'll see in game-based approach illustrations, a recall of what happened, a time to identify, using our existing skills, knowledge and understanding, the problem, and arrive at a solution which we probably, the students, already know the answer to. We've just provided them a context to recall that and describe it. If we have a look at most of the descriptions of a game-based approach, they give non-specific cognitive instructions. They just ask the students to answer a question which is going to most likely recall a strategy that is previously known. Most of the instructions that we'll see in game-based approaches do not use the word create, do not use the word evaluate. So there is no direction to the learner to use the cognitive behaviour of creativity or evaluation. Certainly in a mixed ability and mixed experience situation, some students may recall because they have that skills, knowledge and understanding. Some may, in that mixed ability class, not have that skills. But when the more experienced other draws on their skills, knowledge and understanding to identify the problem and suggest a solution, all the rest of the class that is hearing that now have the answer. So they are not doing any creation either. From then on, it will be testing their recall and their degree of understanding of the solution that they've heard from one of the more experienced players in their group. Next slide, please, Brendan. So from a spectrum lens, it's questionable. The ability to guarantee that in a class that, or even in a coaching situation with our players, that all of the participants as learners are starting from the same cognitive point, from the same skills, knowledge and understanding toolkit, and therefore being able to discover at exactly the same moment is somewhat problematic. All of those learners will be at a different part of their learning journey. They'll be at different stages of development in their understanding of the game. So from the spectrum perspective of even asking a series of questions cannot be assumed that will lead the players or the students in your class to the same answer at the same point in time. And indeed, most of the demonstrations that we see of what is labelled, including in my own work, where I erroneously previously described a game-based approach as guided discovery, does not use that process of a sequential series of questions, moving the learner cognitively one step at a time towards the answer, and generally in a guided discovery approach, it's a predetermined answer because there is a known solution to the problem that is being presented, And the skill of the teacher or the coach is in the art of sequencing the questions to move the learner one cognitive step at a time towards the discovery of that answer. And we do not see that level of prescriptive sequencing in questions in very many of the examples of a game-based approach. Brendan, next slide.
Is that, are you hand passing over to me now, or?
Well, as I said, you were doing the counting. So if you've counted to 7, right, then it's over to you.
I think so. All right. Thank you very much, Pilly. So I gather some of the things that Shane has said is perhaps a little bit new or confronting, or for those of you who have heard us or read some of our stuff before, we have maybe introduced some of these ideas. So we might just go through a couple more as well. So if you looked at the idea of saying you had a class of students, or you're coaching, say, 20 students, and you were playing the game of field hockey, and you presented a problem to them saying, look, we're new to field hockey. I'd like you to go off and dribble the ball around, one ball, one stick, for a few moments, and then come on back in, we'll have a bit of a chat. So that's very generic, very broad kind of setting to get them on task early. And then again, as Shane was saying, you may have some questions that are open-ended, such as, how did you position your hands on the stick to control the ball? Now, even this concept, if you haven't found out where your students are, how much experience they've had, they've gone away and dribbled and experimented, and they may have discovered, but when you bring them back in, you're asking them questions that they know the answer to. And this part here, you may then ask them a follow-up question such as, do you have greater control when you've got one hand on the stick or two hands on the stick? And again, depending on the amount of knowledge that they already have with regards to, say, using a striking implement with two hands, like maybe even a cricket bat, but a hockey stick, they may already have this knowledge. For example, that the further my hands are apart, the greater control I have. They might be able to verbalize it to you like that, but they may already know that. But even in a situation such as this, there's going to be a very good chance that a portion of your students already know the answer to this and are recalling the answer that they knew, and others may discover it. But, and we're going to make this point as we go along here, you only usually discover something once. And after that, you'll recall that knowledge or refine it. So if we use a spectrum lens to look through coaching or teaching episodes like this, we would say that in some cases, you have students where you are probably using what's known as a practice style approach, in that some students are recalling strategies or tactics or movements that they already knew before you even began the class. When you asked the question, and as I gave an example and Pilly mentioned as well, we would suggest that sometimes the language used in game-based approaches is, if you want to say, very non-specific, and it's not usually asking people to discover or create. It will sometimes be very broad and say, go and play this game, you're given the rules, then you bring them back in and ask them questions. So the spectrum is very specific on saying that teaching is a chain of deliberate decision-making. So if I have not asked a student to discover, then I will not claim that I have taught them that. They may have discovered, but it wasn't necessarily because I directed them to as a teacher, so to speak. And as Pilly was starting to allude to before, one of the big problems with using discovery episodes in game-based approaches, or discovery episodes in general, is that there's this presumption that the only way that this can actually be done with a big group is if every student or participant came to our class with the exact same homogenous knowledge of what we're about to do. And we know that that is just not true. It would make teaching perhaps very easy, but it's not true. And then the other one is, of course, that even if they did come with that knowledge, and then you proceeded to ask a series of questions, they would have to process those questions at the exact same speed for everyone to be discovering at the exact same time. And that's, of course, what makes it difficult, but certainly not impossible. Now, the other option is, if you do have students in your class who do not know the answers to the problem that you have set in this little episode, then there is, of course, a chance they are doing convergent discovery, which I'll speak about a little bit more in a moment, which you seek one solution, or they could be doing divergent discovery where they're actually creating many solutions to the problem. But the key is in knowing the knowledge that your students bring to the class, which of course can be exceptionally challenging as well. So as Pilly said, one of the defining characteristics in terms of the questioning is that you are guiding the player to discover or understand concepts through questioning. Very specific questioning, very tight questioning, I would also suggest, where it's this little step-by-step approach to them. In some cases, it might be a memory question or a memory question and then an aha moment. And I also think it's quite funny. Humans don't always do this, but somewhere it was put in us that when we do discover something, we actually do that. Oh, I didn't know that. And there's this sense of joy and these big wide eyes and this funny noise going, aha, or wow, or something like that. Now, just to give you an example, Pilly also mentioned this before about, and this is a bit of a Brendan term, I sometimes say I think the language in Discovery episodes is like cognitively sloppy. Some people would say my language is quite often sloppy anyway, but this is an example of some language that I found from a paper that someone did at a conference once, where they described they were teaching, I think it was rugby union to some people in Japan. And of course, they were struggling with this concept, a little bit of, running forward, putting the ball back and then throwing it backwards, quite unique, English and Australian games. And they said, as they improve their performance of the drill, I encouraged them, that would be the students, to be creative and try some variations by demonstrating a few options, such as looping around the ball to receive it. And I thought, this is where it seems very confusing, that if you want someone to be creative, I don't think it would really help that much of saying, okay, here's a couple of examples. Here's a few things I prepared earlier. Now, don't copy them because that would be copying, but I want you to create your own thing. You would nearly have to ask, why would a teacher be presenting an example of something if they did not want them to reproduce it? And in fact, demonstration is normally done like in styles A, B, C through to E, so that because you want someone to replicate that subject matter, not actually in the case of guided discovery, etc. So through a spectrum lens, as we've already identified, there are cognitive liabilities when you have two or more people involved in a discovery episode. And Ashworth says flat out, you really can't guarantee they're both going to be able to discover. And again, when a spectrum lens is used to view this, when you have, say, student A and student B at the bare minimum doing a discovery episode, and let's say student A discovers and yells out the answer or says the answer, student B is now unable to discover because student A has said it out loud. Student A has essentially taken the place of a teacher telling student B, this is the answer to the question. So this is one of the reasons why, as well, it's a cognitive liability in terms of doing it. And when this happens, yes, one student can discover, but the other student then is probably going to replicate or recall the knowledge, which generally puts it in line with practice style B. So, as I said though, how do we do this? It doesn't mean all is lost, and Shane and I have not just come here to say, oh, you can't do discovery. You can do guided discovery episodes. Pilly, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, so just in summary, unless a teacher, coach has intentionally drawn out the skills, knowledge and understanding the players have, so they're absolutely clear, skills, knowledge and understanding, they can't plan for the players to create. They can only plan for the players to create by building on what the players already know, do, and can understand. The science of creativity says you build from the foundation of your knowledge. And therefore, to target an extension of that, which is the creative piece, or to use that in a novel situation as the creativity, or to transfer it to the unknown, which is where the creativity piece must occur, the teacher or coach must have a clear understanding of the performance capabilities. And that performance capability is both the cognitive and the motor capabilities of their players. Otherwise, they're just guessing as to whether it will be a creative piece. They can't actually know that it will be a creative piece. And as Brendan has said, it's most likely that the players will draw on their existing knowledge retrieval practice, which then becomes practicing for refinement of their thinking and not a discovery process.
Yeah, I actually think, at the risk of going off topic, which I'm very good at, in this day and age of education and things being nailed down so tightly with standardized testing and people wanting to get great results, we've largely removed, I think, a lot of episodes which require discovery. And I think in a lot of cases, some of the first times you use these episodes with your classes or with your students, there will be this massive pause as they sit there and think, hang on, what do you want me to do? Because they actually are so used to teachers, I think, or us saying, this is what we're doing, this is how it works. And then we go into like a practice style episode where you are practicing recalling, which in one way is good pedagogy because we give them tests so much. And of course we want them to do well. But discovery learning is high failure, highly challenging, sometimes time consuming. And in this really lockdown environment, I think at times people go, oh, it takes a bit too much time, we better not do it. But we forget about the fun that's involved in it, I think. So, all right, so 3 discovery episodes that we're going to talk about, or try to speak about briefly. First of all, guided discovery, which is style F on the spectrum. It's pretty much the logical and sequential design of questions that lead a person or a student to discover a predetermined response. Now, this would be the teaching style that seems to be associated mostly with a game-based approach. So how do we get it really broadly? First of all, one, as Pilly was just saying previously, you've got to set a problem that people do not know the answer to. You cannot discover something that you already know. Now, I know that might blow some people's hair back. Someone once said to me, what if I forget? I'd go, well, that means you forgot. And then when you remembered, you remembered. So you actually knew it, but you just forgot it for a period of time. But you're not rediscovering it. You just forgot it. The other thing is, it normally needs to be a couple of steps. You don't just discover something like, hey, what's in my pocket? Oh, it's a lolly. No, there needs to be a cognitive searching for the answer. In terms of game-based approaches, I quite often teach undergraduates that the simple way for you to think about this, because I think a guided discovery approach freaks a lot of people out. They think, oh, when do I stop and ask the questions? I say that the simple ones to start off with is when you see an error or you see something doing well. I think a lot of people are quite good at identifying the error, but again, you don't just want to be the negative teacher that only picks on things wrong. You also want to identify when someone does something well, and you might ask a series of questions for that. I think it's quite mind-blowing to see that when you actually ask someone did something well, and then you ask them how they did it, sometimes they don't actually know the answer to that anyway. So there is that opportunity. Is that another hand up, Pilly, or is...
Yeah, I want to reiterate at this point something that I took from Eric Worthington's work, that the master teacher or coach actually has an understanding that the game will provide a moment. And it's at that moment that they come in with their inquiry episode, or as Worthington called it, their living whiteboard. So if you know the players well, you've intentionally designed the game to present the problem. You wait for the problem to occur. You know it's going to be confronting to the players. It breaks down as Brendan has described. And that's when you can come in with your discovery episode. Because if they knew the answer to the problem, the game wouldn't have broken down at that point in time.
Absolutely. And thanks for chucking that in, Pilly, because I was actually thinking that's nearly how I also would explain it as the second level. So as you get the courage to ask these questions, you also, when you get students to think about, as in pre-service teachers going, if you're playing a game, most invasion games, there will be a point where you know students will try and pass through a defender. So you're able to kind of predict this is going to happen at some point, or they'll wait till they get too close and things such as that. A way to use a guided discovery approach as well when you do have a big group, because the reality is we would hate you to walk away from this going, oh, that's it. I'm not doing guided discovery unless I've got a one-on-one. No, we all know we have classes of 20 or more. Is that when you start asking the questions, you may actually say to the students, okay, we're not going to answer these out loud. You're going to answer them to yourself, and you're going to try and ask the questions to them And then when you've asked your final question, you might say, all right, Brendan, turn to your partner, Shane, and tell him what you think the answer is. If you two agree, give a high five. If you don't agree, you've got 30 seconds each to convince the other one why you're correct. So then the students are involved in some kind of dialogue, which quite often can end up in some kind of discovery as well between them. And then you ask the pair to share their agreed response at the end. If you're doing divergent discovery, where that is you set a problem that has 2 or more solutions and you let the students play, they come up with the solutions, then you ask them, write the solutions on post-it notes and stick them on the whiteboard. And then you might actually ask other students who have been in different groups, go and pick one of those strategies off the whiteboard and give it a dummy run in your own group and see how successful it is or isn't. So that way people are not yelling out the answers and they're actually trialing them and see how they go. And another way to try and get discovery is use Bell's strategy of if, then, because questions to try and assist students making predictions or identify cause and effect relationships. So you might begin with saying, okay, Shane, we're playing touch football or touch rugby. I'm not sure what it's called in the United Kingdom, but touch footy. That you say, Shane, finish or help me out with it. Run really hard to your left, the defender will follow you. And then when their shoulders have turned to the left, you turn back to the right, it's hard for them to go because, and then he may fill in the blanks for you about that relationship. You can also, I think it was, is it Mel Hamadapilli who made up the cards, I think, with if, then, because as well, to do those ones.
Yeah, Mel used
So,
a visible thinking routine and had the students predict responses using a visible thinking routine.
yeah, and I think she's written that as an article too, hasn't she, somewhere, I'm pretty sure. So good article to get your hands on. Convergent discovery is the style that comes immediately after guided discovery, where the teacher sets a problem and there is one solution to this problem. Students then go away and use whether it's trial by error, practice, reasoning, etc. Hopefully movement in our subjects, fantastic opportunity to do it, to try and discover the correct response. Now, don't feel bad here. I made this mistake numerous times as I was teaching. You never want to ask for one response when there are in fact more than one response, because then you kind of set yourself up when the kid goes, oh, sir, I've got this one. Yep, that's a good one, but that's not the one I was looking for. Yeah, but it's right, isn't it? Well, it is right, but it's not the one I was looking for. So if there's 2 or more responses, it's actually the next style, which is known as divergent discovery. But I'll just quickly give an example of a convergent discovery episode. Let's say had a class beginning off with holding a cricket bat. You might say, students, we're going to try and discover the best way or the pluses and minuses of holding a cricket bat. So experiment 1, I want you to pick up your cricket bat, hands apart, and I'd like you to dribble a ball in between some markers over the 5 meters and come back. Your partner's going to use the stopwatch, record your time, and then he or she will do the same thing. Experiment 2, I want you to hold your cricket bat, this time with your hands together. They've got to be touching. And I'd like you to do the same thing, same distance, weave between the markers, and then swap with your partner. Then you bring them back in, and of course you ask questions such as, well, which one was faster? Which one was easier to control? And then maybe use an activity. Students, finish this sentence for me. The closer my hands are together, the greater or lesser control I have. And they would then, of course, converge on this one answer that they would find out. Now, again, as we said at the start, if you had children in this class who had played cricket to a certain level, they would be able to tell you the answer to this episode before you even did it. So they would not be using convergent discovery. They would be using practice style. And finally, divergent discovery is where you set a problem as the teacher or coach, where there are multiple answers to the problem, and you ask the student to create ways to solve the problem in general. It is, again, there's quite often a bit of a freeze in this one if you haven't done it before, but as you encourage it more and more and more, or small sections of your learning or your classroom or your coaching, I think students become more accepting that if I'm doing something new, there will be failure and I won't always get it correct as well. So an example of this, maybe let's say if we're doing something like netball or basketball, you've got 2 attackers in the blue, defender in the green. You might say, I would like you, attacker 2, to try and create 2 or more ways to receive a pass from attacker 1. Write them on a post-it note, stick them up on the board. I would say, or we would say, that there's roughly about 5, the old straight ahead and to your left, straight ahead and to your right, straight ahead, straight back, straight ahead to your left, then back to your right, straight ahead to your right, back to your left. And then, of course, there is roughly the 355 other options, because there's 360 degrees in a circle, I guess. But these are the basics that a student would probably come up with in terms of a divergent discovery approach. So just to kind of recap on this concept of discovery and creativity, you can only discover something once. And after that, most times humans will actually go away and practice it. Sarah Ashworth once said to me that discovery and creativity is like a firework. It explodes brightly and quickly, but then it's gone. Because we normally don't just discover something and move on. We discover something and then try and get better and better and better at it. And of course, if someone already has this knowledge before you do the learning experience, then they'll be recalling the strategy, not discovering something. And finally, I think Pilly and I have gone over our time. What a shock. Some shameless self-promotion. If you're interested in the spectrum of teaching styles and physical education, some fantastic people helped us put this book together a few years ago. I would say there's the big names, and I'm showing my spectrum nerdiness here, the big names of the spectrum world contributed chapters in this book. And there is also the book that we wrote, the spectrum of sport coaching, the spectrum of sport coaching styles on the left and the spectrum of teaching styles in PE on the right. So is it time to hand over to questions, Ellen or Dr. GameSense, or did you have anything you want to add?
You're in charge, Dr. Seuss, unless you've passed the baton to the wonderful Ellen.
Ellen, questions or?
Yeah, does anyone have any questions? I've got nothing in the chat at the moment, but does anybody have anything they would like to ask, either in the chat or popping the hand up or speaking through on the webinar? Alex, I've got you.
Alex, I put a bet on before that you were going to ask the first question, so thank you. I've come good with the bet.
Yeah, no worries, Pilly. Thank you very much for that. As someone who works with novice PE teachers and sports coaches, and helping them plan for episodes of guided discovery, I really struggle with it. So I've often find they can't be planned for properly. It's what emerges out of what's happening within the gameplay. Do you have any advice for me to better support the novices with planning for and being prepared for guided discovery episodes?
Pilly, thanks. I was going to say, Alex, Pilly really helped me refine this one a little bit more, because as I said, I'm not meaning to insult anyone here, especially not pre-service teachers, but my dumbed down version was to start off, as I said, like, you know something's going to be going well and you know something will go wrong. And then I think he took my ability to plan for it to the next level when he brought in that, I think, Worthington comment about saying, and this is where it actually reminds me also of that David Kirk comment about teaching games for understanding, where he questioned, do you have to be a fighter pilot? Which I would say not necessarily, but if you know the game, you know the common things that people will normally do or novices will normally do. So like, I guess the example I gave before, like if it was, you know, basketball or netball or Australian football, is quite often people run right up to the defender and then try and pass it through them. So you can nearly already sit at home, I think, and plan for saying, If we play like a 3 versus 1 passing game, I know at some point I am going to see that happen. So how about I start to plan for an episode like that? Pilly, did you want to?
Yes, Alex, what we do with our pre-service teachers is we go into Mosston and Ashworth's teaching physical education book. We show them the shot put example, which is the best description of a guided discovery approach, which goes bit by bit towards the convergence on the answer that you want them to discover. So they can really see the layering of the progressive questioning, taking them one little step at a time to converge eventually on getting the answer. And then we ask them to design a game which has a particular point where they predict the game will break down. This is all hypothetical, of course, because we don't have actual class. We're saying design the game for this moment. And then in this moment, you design the series of questions that will lead them to what Brendan described as the aha moment. So it's not one question. It's not ad hoc. It's not I see something and I ask the question. It's the spectrum is based on the premise of intentional decision making. So we've actually gone into this activity, this game, waiting for the moment. When the moment occurs, that's when we use our guided discovery. From a cog psych perspective, if every time we see a problem in the game, minor or major, we stop the game, we'll provide cognitive dispersal. Now, repetition is the gateway to habituation because it'll move it from our short-term memory to our long-term memory. So we actually want cognitive focus. If we've gone and planned this activity to produce a moment, which is the focus of the learning for the lesson or the session we're doing, we can't stop it on all of these other things. We have to be disciplined as a teacher or coach to wait for the moment where we wanted to focus our learning, because it's part of a sequence that also we've intentionally designed, which is built up to this moment. We've been layering and leveling towards this moment. To do anything else will provide cognitive distortion on the idea because we'll have infiltrated with other conversations, and we'll give them cognitive dispersal because there's too many things to think about during the coaching session or the lesson. So we need to have that discipline as a teacher or coach to wait for the moment that we've planned for, and then we bring out the series of questionings that we've also intentionally planned for to use in that moment.
Thank you very much.
I have a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to go with the first one. What's your perspective of integrating ICT in PE lessons? So this person said they find it disruptive to get the students to take out their devices to record or pen down their thoughts or reflections.
Yeah, look, I think that's you're right, it's a challenge. I remember when I probably first started doing things like this in PE, kids saying to me, when I'd say, go get a pen, and this was, even 15 years ago when they were writing on paper, kids going to me, why am I getting a pen? This is PE. Okay, just go get a pen, please. So, and where I am in Australia is a little bit, I'm in Brisbane, so bit of a subtropical climate, not quite Singapore hot, but let's just say in a lot of cases, you're getting kids to write who've got sweaty hands. They're putting paper in their pocket or tucking it in a band somewhere where they're sweaty. But all as I would probably say to that is, you're right, it is slightly disruptive if you are only about maximizing physical activity. Anytime someone's going for a run and you ask them to take out a pen and paper, that's not going to help running. But if you want thinking and you want some quality thinking, then I think you're probably going to have to invest some time in that in some case. And if you want evidence of that, it's either evidence of thinking is either done through what we say, what we write, or what we actually do through movement, as we can in our case. But yes, it takes time, but most things that are worthwhile do take time.
And my answer to that is absolutely I want ICT because it powers up the learning potential of the class. Anytime I'm able to use a visual representation to recall the moment so that they're not having to rely on their memory, the memory is there because they can see it, it's going to power up the capacity to analyze that situation. Now, there's a reason why we use video in high performance coaching sessions. why we video every session that we do, so that we can then have the conversations with our players as learners afterwards. We've got many examples of high-performing physical education programs in Australia where every PE lesson is videotaped. It goes onto the school intranet, and the teacher is setting questions for reflections at the end of the lesson. And this is not a new phenomena. I can remember back in the early 2000s, a phys ed teacher in a very difficult school. This is a school with a big fence around it to keep certain types of individuals out of the school during the day and keep the majority of students in the school during the day, winning awards for turning the school's program around because every physical education lesson was videoed, every physical education lesson was a game, and the students were being asked to think about their game through reflective questioning. And all of a sudden, the students who used to be AWOL from phys ed at school on the day they had phys ed were attending because phys ed had become their favourite lesson. The other thing that I would suggest is that there's a reason why in high performance settings, whether it be junior high performance settings or adult high performance settings, the notebook is the most important thing that the player brings to the briefing, because the notebook enables you to get deeper into your thinking and your reflection than just by sitting and listening. So absolutely, if we're into the holistic development of people so that they can develop the capacity to be independent, self-regulated learners who have self-responsibility and motivation for their activity behaviour, we need to take them on the journey towards that. It doesn't happen by osmosis, and just being in a PE class is not going to be the vehicle for encouraging these young people to develop the habits of mind that lead to the habits of behaviour to be independent activity seekers. We have to teach for that.
Thank you. I'm going to pass this over to Ashley, who's got his hand up.
Yeah, thanks, guys. That was really interesting. The institution I work at here in the UK, we have been asked to deliver a kind of games-based skill acquisition type presentation to a group of kind of very high-level elite coaches that are working in the program nationally, internationally. So I guess they're going to come with certain mindset, background, lots of experience. What would be your advice for supporting those coaches in that, working in that environment, for developing their questioning within a kind of games-based setting?
First of all, you've got to know, you got to know what they know. The first part about it is finding out what they already know. So using an inquiry process, whether that be a technologically based one where you're using some sort of online poll or a Miro board or something that they can go into and find out what they know about questioning, what they believe about questioning strategies, and the impact that it has on their players. Once you've got that baseline on their assumptions and their philosophies, and you can get a hold on whether they're going to buy into what you're saying or not, you can go into it. In my experience working with high-performing teams, you'll get a range of buy-in. It's best to start with the ones that are sympathetic to what you're going to say, because then they'll have the power to influence the others. So try to identify very early on who the champions of the idea are, because they will be your advocates amongst their peers for the ideas that you're trying to present. So I have a very flexible approach to the presentation where you've got some pre-prepared material, but also be prepared to go off script to meet their needs, which is just good learning, because until you know where you need to pitch it based on where they are, you can't construct their learning. Essentially, you'll just be going and enabling them to consolidate what they already know, do, and understand.
Yeah, Ashley, it's something we didn't speak about, obviously, in this presentation because we probably spoke for long enough anyway, but there's a concept in the spectrum that Mosston speaks about called a non-versus approach. So this idea is actually, so there are 11 styles on the spectrum, and Mosston says none are better than the other. They're only valued for what they can achieve. And he actually says having a versus approach, is how a lot of things are viewed. And I'll definitely sound like a spectrum nerd here. I even, the minute I read this concept, it took a little, a couple of months, or I guess, to sink in. But I thought, actually, this is how a lot of people have conversations, is always a versus perspective, that one thing is better than the other. So I haven't coached to the same level as Pilly have. I've coached more kids sport, but even I'm aware of people going, oh, you can't just play games the whole time. You go, No one's suggesting you play games the whole time. Oh, that's all that Game Sense wants. No, it doesn't. Oh, you can't just ask questions the whole time. Well, it doesn't say you just ask questions the whole time either. So everything has a time and a place, just the same as sometimes direct instruction has a place, but direct instruction's place is not all the time. And it's the same for asking questions. So no one teaching style or coaching style can achieve everything. If it could, well, then we'd all just use it, but it can't. So to probably add to what Pilly said, like that's sometimes the other one I think that's quite often a pushback is someone thinks that, you know, you're only selling one thing. So if you're talking about questioning, you're only talking about questioning and that's all you want the coach to do. Well, no, it's if I want to achieve discovery, then I'll use questioning. But if I don't want someone to discover something, I probably won't use one of those styles.
And there's lots of different questioning strategies. And so part of it is knowing what the coaches are wanting to achieve with their players. And once you know what the coaches are trying to achieve with their players, you can direct them towards a particular inquiry strategies. There are lots of great inquiry strategies from visible thinking, from visible learning that aren't included in a game-based approach, but they can be used with a game-based approach. The visible thinking strategies are really good because they make the thinking of the individual clear so that you have an understanding of what they understand. So you use that questioning strategy to begin with to make the thinking visible. Once the thinking is visible, then you can do something with it as a coach and move to a different type of inquiry strategy. But the starting point is actually to know what the intentions of the coaches are, because the teaching style that you use is intentionally matched to the outcome that you want from the task.
Thank you both. Really useful. Thank you.
I've got two questions in the chat. I'm going to start with Diana's. So in terms of methods of delivering questions, can't students learn a great deal from each other? Is there value in starting with a broad question that will allow for a variety of tactical responses, then guide the students through a series of more specific questions?
Yeah, so if I'm understanding that correctly, what it sounds like what Diane's saying, like a broad question, first of all, if you were saying you were asking students to search for 2 or more solutions to something. And what Diane's question also indicates is the spectrum actually speaks about learning as being episodic. So there's episodes of learning. So it's quite unusual that you would say, okay, well, hey, I'm going to do divergent discovery for 70 minutes. It's quite cognitively taxing. And again, if you were the only one ever doing it in your school, I'm sure there'd be a bit of pushback from kids wondering, why does this guy just keep setting me problems? Does he have any answers himself? So you might, Diane, start with something quite broad and then engage in a conversation with a student who is perhaps, if you want to say, stuck or just seeking further clarification. And then, yes, a guided discovery episode may actually take place if you decide to ask those questions. At the same time, you might decide, oh, look, I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to give them the information and let them go back to their, divergent discovery episode, trying to solve the problem and come up with solutions.
And I'd like to layer the possibility. So you might set a broad question, but then use a think, pair, share inquiry strategy. So the individual has to do the cognitive inquiry, the answer individually. And then once they've done that individual inquiry and come up to an answer, they share and test the assumptions with another person and then present it back to the group for member checking afterwards. So the inquiry strategy is layered, not just in physical education and sports coaching, but in education generally. The broadcasting of a question to a group is considered to have low outcomes, a low teaching efficacy. You know, if you're asking a question and you're targeting a specific person with the answer and then bouncing that around to get an idea by questioning a range of students in the class at random, so you get a randomized sample of their answers to get a understanding perhaps of where the collective is at with their learning, then you're doing it for that purpose, to get a randomized sample of what people are thinking, keep the students a little bit on their toes. Anybody could be asked the question, and you create a culture within your class that everybody should be ready to answer a question when the question is asked. But this broadcasting of an answer to 20 people and waiting for one person to respond to it and then hope that the other students will be stimulated to respond from there, hope is not a good enough strategy. And as professionals, we should be intentional and deliberate in our design of strategies to bring about outcomes. So as I said, if it's broadcasting a very general question to the class, followed up by the inquiry strategy of think, pair, share, then I see high value in the activity.
Thank you both. And one final question from Kelly. I find that teachers, not just pre-service teachers, struggle to develop what to ask to guide learning, challenging on their content knowledge. So question scaffolds such as the debate of ideas, reflective toss, etc. have been useful. Is there still a place for these scripted questions, or how are you best to develop teachers' questioning strategies?
I'm with the scaffolding. Yeah, I'm with the scaffolding. As you know, I've got the who, what, why, when, how, with an extended Laban's movement framework as a way of thinking about actually deliberately planning the questions that you intend to ask before you go into a class. And indeed, that model can be used to scaffold the focus questions that you would use for each lesson over a unit of work. And I've got that in my play with purpose. And you need the scaffolds until you have the deep content knowledge that enables you to have the capacity to answer the questions. So it's like becoming an expert in anything. It takes time, it takes repetition, it takes practice, and you build your knowledge over time to this part where you become an expert in that domain, and you'll be less reliant on the scaffold because the scaffold is there in your head, using that as a metaphor.
Yeah, I agree. I think, Kelly, again, like this concept in the spectrum of a non-versus approach. So debate of ideas, if you said, I would really like my students to have a learning experience or the opportunity to consolidate their own thoughts and be able to express them to someone else and convince them, then that's a great strategy for doing that. So yeah, absolutely. But just again, be mindful that all questions only, I guess, accomplish the things that they're set out to do. And we've got to line that behavior up with our objective or what it is we want. And that's, I guess, a concept of this deliberate teaching that the spectrum has of saying, if I want someone to do synchronous movement in time with someone else and move when I instruct them to move or someone else, well, then I shall use style A. But and it might be something like synchronized swimming. But if I'm saying I want someone to solve a problem, I won't be doing style A. Those two things don't go together. So yeah, of course, teaching strategies like scaffolding are fantastic. And as Pilly said in his Play with Purpose books, he's got the 5 W's and the H, which is good scaffolding as well.
I've noticed a hand up. Is it Sam? Yeah, Sam.
Should be able to hear me, hopefully.
Yep.
Brilliant. Okay. Thanks for the presentation. Okay, it's a wonderful presentation. Really enjoyed it as always. Probably just thinking out loud, really, just listening to the presentation and sort of my thoughts, really, in terms of this. I'd just be interested to get some other thoughts, but really sort of thinking back in terms of game-based approaches and just thinking more about what Brendan, you said at the start as well, and Shane. So obviously the different types of, say if you're going down maybe more of a practice or you're going down conversion or diversion and the types of questions that you may ask. But I'm thinking as well in terms of how this connects more broadly to a game-based approach. If we think in terms of maybe the game itself, and obviously that game has got to be set up or designed in a way that's going to, say afford the learners or players the opportunity to practice what you want them to practice or to be guided towards what you're trying to guide them to. And in relation to that, then, if you've got to design that right game or right practice, you've got to be thinking about, so I'll use the word constraints when we talk about, say modifications or representation, for example. So how these things all interlink to me plays an interesting part as a coach or a teacher in terms of what you're observing in your practice and the decision making that you may have to make as the coach or teacher in terms of how you may support your learners or your players or athletes, however you're defining them, in your practice, in terms of the type of questioning that you're using, but then how you're using that question in your practice to guide their understanding. And I'm just interested to get your thoughts on this, really. And it's probably more of a piece of research, this. But in terms of this decision making that goes into this process and how these things all interlink, it's more broadly than just the questioning or the conversion, or practice style. It starts with that game. It comes around, well, I use the term, say, manipulation of constraints, for example, and therefore what you may also need to do in your practice, because as you mentioned, Brendan, it's also so that term that you used in terms of it being so what did you mention? I forgot. What you said before about it being episodic, sorry. So that was the term that you said, sorry, it went out of my mind. So if it's episodic, then you've got to be considering, to me, that may change in the types of constraints that you may then need to manipulate in your practice to support that next stage of the questioning in terms of guiding your learners. So just some thinking out loud there, really. So I don't know if that rambling made any sense, but I was just thinking out loud and sharing some thoughts there through, kind of the presentation and my own views as well. But I'll hand over to you guys anyway.
Yeah, no, I think I understand what you're saying, Sam. And I think you've actually said it quite clearly, and why I think at times when people start going down whatever term you wish to use, game-based approaches, or some of the terms we've used here, the discovery teachings or coaching styles, there's this real feeling of, I know roughly what's going to be happening here, but I do not know 100% that when I've got 20 students and we play this 3 versus 1 game, I do not know 100% where they're all going to be at. And I think that's the part that can become quite frightening to teachers. But at the same time, as you're going along, you do need to, I think, cut yourself some slack, because this is the great irony. Just because you do practice style, same level of doing an activity for 20 students, that doesn't mean that's obviously a super appropriate learning experience either for all 20 of them. For some of them, it's too easy. For some of it's too hard, etc. So sometimes when you might be manipulating the constraints, as you were saying, or making a decision to ask questions or change a rule to try and get them to solve a problem, you might pitch it too hard, too easy, etc. But again, this is, I think, where at the same time, when you do manage to nail these things and watch what the performer's doing, I probably have this image in my head of, it reminds me of like cooking, like boiling water. You don't want the water bubbling out of the pot, but at the same time, you don't want to be sticking your finger in there going, is this on? Is this working? So you want the student working at this level where they're appropriately challenged and you've read the cues correctly, you've asked the right questions, you've changed the rules or the constraint or whatever it is you want them to do.
Yeah, and I'm much older than you and Sam, so I'll use a slightly different language. And I use the metaphor that rules are our tools as sports teachers and coaches, because the games have rules and the rules define the boundaries of play, what, Sam, you might call the constraints. So the boundaries of play give us certain game conditions. So we're intentionally manipulating the rules, modifying them to create conditions within the game. We've intentionally created those conditions, you might call them constraints, within the game, because we want the players to learn something specific through those game encounters. So we've intentionally designed the game by the manipulation of the game rules or the modification of those rules to create a specific game condition, you might call it constraints. The questions that we will ask are absolutely linked to the learning that we've decided we want from that game. So they are all connected. They have to be all connected to give that cognitive focus.
Sorry, just jumping back, Shane. Oh.
No, go on.
Sorry, just a quick one. Sorry, just apologies. Just a quick one then, just thinking about that. So how much then can the game itself in terms of the right design of the game. I'm not saying the game's to teach here, but can it come back and almost prompt questions for the learner without the coach or the teacher coming in? I've seen examples where learners have played a game and the coach has gone over and the learners have already been questioning the coach. It's been a case of going from playing this. I've seen a golf coach do this, for example. The game has kind of stimulated the questions already because it's been designed in such a way that the coach has not had to step in and ask the question. It's been through the manipulation of the constraints, as I would call it, and the design of the game that's prompted that question before the coach has come in.
Yeah, so we often, as teachers and coaches, take away the inquiry that young people naturally, or humans naturally, bring to an encounter. And we socialize people to become dependent on the more knowledgeable other to provide the guidance. What you're describing is a group of players that have been encouraged and are confident to be independent, self-regulated learners. No doubt they've had a coach that has set them up to be the problem solvers and the owner of their behaviour on the field. So therefore, they will come with those questions. They will come there because they've been empowered to do so. So again, the coach is creating that environment that empowers the players to be that way. This is, in my experience, not something that happens very often automatically or intuitively. And I like to use the phrase that you don't learn something just simply by osmosis being there in the park. There is generally a process that's been involved, a process of observation and mimicry, a process of expectation of being able to do something. So it doesn't matter which model I draw on, whether it come from ecological dynamics or cognitive perspective, I generally see that there is some cognitive setting of expectation from that game. So the players don't go in there as neutral performers. Players go in there with an aim, and then they're questioning their ability to achieve that aim, and the coach is coming in helping them with the inquiry. But that is only possible because the coach has cognitively set a performance expectation.
Thank you very much. Alex, I've noticed you put a comment on here about the TGfU SIG developing video representations of questioning strategies and scaffolds. Things like this are on sort of my agenda in terms of bringing forth with professional development and such. If anyone does have any other suggestions in terms of content they would like on webinars, or things they would like to see more on the website, please do drop me an email on the normal tgfu.info@gmail.com link, and I will sort something out and see if we can try and get things coming through.
Can I just go in there, Alan, very quickly? Alex,
yep.
A colleague of ours, John Williams at University of Canberra, ran a really spectacular conference where he got his pre-service teachers to run particular teaching episodes, which were then videotaped. I know Shape America during COVID made them available as stimulus material for pre-service teachers. John's very generously shared them with other people. That's the sort of thing that you don't actually need the TGfU SIG to do. You can actually do with your own students, and most universities have media studies, visual production capabilities. So sometimes we can be our own best service as a community by generating them ourselves and then using TGfU SIG as a conduit for dissemination.
Thank you for that, Shane. So yeah, if you do have any suggestions or do want to submit your own videos, lesson plans, resources, etc., please do get in touch. I want to thank everybody for coming to this very extended webinar. Went on a lot longer than we all expected, but thank you for sticking with us. Thank you as well to Brendan and Shane for presenting today. All the webinar link, the certificate of attendance and the slides will be sent to you all before the weekend. So thank you all for coming. Thank you to Brendan and Shane for presenting today. We will see you next time.
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you for organising it, Alan.